As industrial action commences in Nigeria, the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria has thrown its weight behind the federal government's proposal for a new minimum wage of 60,000 naira per month. Now, this in no way resolves the impasse between the organized labor and the federal government over what is payable as minimum wage. Well, despite persistent power outages plaguing Nigeria, distribution companies have reportedly seen an increase in revenue. This disparity has sparked outrage amongst citizens struggling with epileptic power supply. Now, in a move aimed at boosting foreign exchange liquidity in Nigeria, the Central Bank of Nigeria has announced a new policy for international oil companies, clarifying how they can repatriate their export proceeds. We will be looking at all these this morning, even as we engage our correspondents on the field documenting the strike action in Nigeria. This is Business Edge. I am Lekon Obanjo. Thank you so much for joining us. Investors traded a total of 2.189 billion shares worth 31.303 billion naira and 39,362 deals last week, compared to 1.986 billion shares valued at 40.715 billion naira and 38,487 deals in the penultimate week. Now, the financial services industry dominated the market, accounting for 87.41% of the total volume and 76.42% of the total value traded. The oil and gas industry followed this, while the agriculture industry came third. The top three traded equities were RB Mortgage Bank PLC, Access Holdings PLC, and Zenith Bank PLC. Now, given the strong buying activity last week, analysts anticipate a potential sentimental reversal this week. So at this point, we'll quickly take a look at the numbers, beginning with the All Share Index. Now, we see that it's about 99,300.38 in closing, with a percentage differential in appreciation of about 1.73%. Look at market capitalization now. Of course, we see the market closing at 56.17 trillion naira in capitalization, but of course 1.73% in a percentage plus a differential. Let's now look at the top price gainers for last week. Top in the charts is Fidelity Bank, closing at 10 naira 20 kobo. Dangote Sugar, that has been hobbling between the gaining fields and the losing fields, is at number 2 for last week, closing at 47 naira, followed by Nascon 40 naira 85 kobo, FCMB 8 naira, and of course UBA 22 naira 20 kobo. And when you see the percentage differentials, there is a positive trend showing that these stocks are actually doing quite well in the double digits anyway. 22.89, 20.51, 20.15, of course 17.65, and 15.63 percentage in terms of what they've been able to achieve as regards value. We now look at the top losers for last week. Top of the chart is CNI Leasing, closing at 2 naira 97 kobo. NPFM CRFBK 1 naira 60 kobo. F10 Cocoa 1 naira 10 kobo. Learn Africa closing at 3 naira 30 kobo. Fits in 14 naira 90 kobo. Of course, you see the differentials there. Double digits for the two top stocks that actually lost for last week, and in the single digits, a downward trend of 8.33, 6.25, and minus 5.40%. Finally, we look at the sectoral performance for last week, and we have the banking industry in the positive trajectory. It's in about 2 weeks now that we've seen the banking industry perform creditably, despite the number of months that we've seen a downward slope in what has happened within that realm. Insurance also had a positive outturn of 3.88%, followed by oil and gas 9.08%, and the consumer goods doing a 2.04%. The only outcast of this is the industrial goods with a deficit of 0.13%. And that's how the stocks and, of course, the sectoral performance has been for last week. When we go on a short break and we return, we'll be looking at our first conversation. Do stay with us. According to reports, it has been confirmed that the organized private sector has accepted government's proposed 60,000 naira minimum wage, emphasizing that much is needed in terms of what can be achieved, looking at the living wage crisis and the minimum wage. Now, however, barring and last-minute changes, field distribution, healthcare, banking, and other essential services nationwide will be shut down. Of course, has been shut down already as an organized labor embark on the indefinite strike over the minimum wage and, of course, the recent hike in electricity tariffs. But then, before we begin to look at this particular issue, we'll look at the situation on ground, and that is talking to our guest. That is the Director General, Manufacturers Association of Nigeria, Segun Ajayi Kadri, is talking to us from Abuja, Nigeria's capital, as we continue to delve into this issue and look at what can actually be achieved in terms of minimum wage. Good morning to you, Segun Ajayi Kadri. It's nice to have you join us on Business Edge.
I'm sorry, I cannot hear you. I can't hear you well. I'm just hearing murmuring. Your voice is not audible.
It's not audible enough. Okay, we'll go on a short break right now and try to fix that so that our guests will be able to hear us clearly from our end. We'll be back in a bit. You're watching Business Edge, and as I told you earlier, according to reports, the organized private sector has accepted 60,000 naira as minimum wage to be paid by the federal government. And we are now looking at the issues around this, even as we have the Director General, Manufacturers Association of Nigeria, Segun Ajayi Kadri, who actually joins us from Abuja, Nigeria's capital, to talk about this. Thank you so much, Segun. I want to believe that you can hear me now.
Better now.
Okay, so we see that the organized private sector, which you actually represent, has agreed to 60,000 naira as minimum wage. Now, this seems to be a far cry from what labor is asking for. What do you think about this? Is it a fair value in terms of what has been asked for and what the NLC is demanding?
Yeah, so thank you for having an issue that is topical at this time to the survival of our economy. Like you rightly said, so which is comprised of NECA, NASMI organizations that represented the organized private sector in the tripartite, the minimum wage. And by tripartite, I mean government sector. And indeed, to negotiate and agree on a be acceptable to all parties will be so. And at the end of the day, we'll be able to guarantee that we have an agreement on what the Nigeria will earn. Because what is no employer that to pay less than that figure. I think it is critical for talking of a minimum wage, not a living wage, other than the minimum that an average Nigerian, that who shows up at work in the career or of the profession or in that environment or working environment less than that figure. So yes, what you have said is right. The organized private sector, 60,000 naira per month on the labor as organized, like you said, a negotiation is supposed to be is to discuss until we all agree that is acceptable to the tripartite, to the three of us?
Shegun Kadiri, it's quite hard getting a hang of things you've said a couple of minutes ago because reception is quite erratic from your end. But then making sense of what you've said, I'd like to get more clarification, most especially knowing the difference between what a living wage is and what a minimum wage is. Maybe if we start from there, then people can begin to have an understanding of what they're demanding for and how right these demands or how feasible these demands can actually come to bear. I'd like you to just expatiate on that. A minimum wage, a living wage. What is the difference?
Okay, so the minimum wage, and I'll try, everybody will understand. So the minimum wage, let me use salary that you pay somebody for the first time in a paid employment. The cleaner, the clerk, at level 1. So that is the wage that you cannot pay below wage. What it should normally mean, and in the best of explanation that one can give, is a wage that would allow you to take care of the essentials. Food, the clothing, the house, the school fees, and so on and so forth. And in the world where a living wage is paid. So if we ask you, for instance, what your living from that of the other person that is on the same cadre, even because you might have a wife and 2 children, the fellow who is sitting next to you, 4 children. The other person may have 2 wives. Each becomes a moving target.
Hello, Shegun Kadiri. Okay, Shegun Kadiri, let's do it this way. I seem to have slight understanding of how you're trying to paint the picture as regards living wage and minimum wage. Now, this actually affects a lot of people in Nigeria, either in the private or in the public sector. And what we want to do now is to go to the streets because, of course, you're aware that there's an industrial action in the country and swift responses from people across board and see how they are feeling as regards this particular strike action. Then we will come back to you, Shegun Kadiri, and try as much as possible to continue with discussion and make meat and sense from your response. So just stay with us. Now, at this point, we have Marshal Ononye, who I believe is at Ikeja in the Lagos axis of the state, of course, Lagos mainland, and he has been monitoring the situation around that area as regards compliance with the industrial action that was actually directed by the organized labor. Marshal Ononye, if you can hear me, I'd like to get feedback from you and give us an update of how it is panning out now where you are.
Well, thank you very much. It's still the same thing as earlier. You have the airport being picketed by the NLC and TUC and the amalgamated Labour Congress members who earlier on, we didn't have this canopy here mounted, but after my report earlier on talking about how the place was shut and passengers are not allowed to go in, neither are those in allowed to come out. Also, workers were not allowed to go in as well. But here we had, after that report, we had some members of the labor union come around and mounted this canopy you find here right in front of the gate. barricading every kind of movement, be it vehicular or pedestrian movement in and out of the GAT. That's the General Aviation Terminal of the MM2. Activities here are still grounded. Nothing seemed to be happening. No flights taking off, no flights coming down. Passengers in and out are not allowed.
So I want to believe you've been able to talk to probably one or two people to ask how they're feeling as regards this, because the way it seems now, their commute has been disrupted. Would they like to, or have they said anything as regards how that has impacted probably their daily activity or what they were trying to achieve while trying to move from point A to point B?
I want to believe, I didn't hear you clearly, but I want to believe you're talking about the labor union, members of the labor unions, as to whether or not they've been able to achieve their objective. Well, yes, they would say yes, but they're not willing to talk in front of the camera. As you do know, it's a national industrial action, and so they would rather allow the communication to come from their head office. But in no time, we would be heading to the office of the labor union in charge of the aviation, and hopefully we'll get a member of the leadership there who will respond to us as to how things are panning out. But here, I tell you for sure, they've been able to achieve their objective, which is to ensure that activities at the airport are grounded.
Okay, so Amasha, what I actually, well said anyway, but what I actually asked is, what about people who have been affected, those who are trying to commute, travel by air and move around from where they are to other places for their various personal endeavor? I actually asked if you have interacted with them to ask how they are feeling and how this has actually disrupted their plans. I don't know if you've spoken to any of them and how they feel.
Yes, we earlier on we spoke with passengers who were distraught. Of course, they were not excited about the strike, but you could see a little bit of, while you see that resentment as to their schedules being disrupted, you could also see you could also feel the kind of support they tend to lend to the call for the increment in the minimum wage. As naturally you would have expected that there would be some agitation from these members of the public whose flights and schedules have been disrupted. But there wasn't really much of agitation. But yes, you could see disappointment on their faces as to their schedule being disrupted.
All right, Marshall, finally, before I let you go, there is speculations as regards for how long this particular industrial action will carry on, owing to the fact that previous industrial actions have been short-lived, maybe a few days after a call by the NLC and the TUC. But then from the body language and the statement of the organized labor, where you are, does it seem as though they are ready to take this particular matter to the letter, standing on their mandate, on their demand to ensure that the government accedes to their demand? Do they mean this particular industrial action as against what used to obtain in the past?
Well, it's funny, you'd say whether Labour means this action, because previously we had seen Labour come up with such proposals, and you could readily interpret the body language of Labour from everything they would say in proposing an industrial action. You would interpret it to mean that they are serious about their strike. But at the end of the day, you know how it always pans out. The Nigerian populace would always be greeted with the news of the strike being suspended for whatever reasons, and mostly these suspensions will be tied to ongoing negotiations, and that's when you find Nigerian populace, being a little bit disappointed and a little bit pessimistic about how these things will turn out. As at today, activities are grounded in various sectors and agencies, departments and ministries. Yes, we see that as a sign of seriousness on Labour calling on the strike. But as to whether or not in the very next minute you would have this same action, the same situation going on, I cannot vouch, and I do not think that the average Nigerian can vouch for the Labour union here.
Okay, Marshal Ononya, thank you so much for giving us updates as regards the industrial action in Ikeja right here, Lagos mainland. We appreciate that. We'll definitely keep on to communicate with you to get more details as the events unfold. Thank you so much. And I will also want to use this opportunity to say a very big thank you to Director General, Manufacturers Association of Nigeria, Segun Ajayi Kadri. Would have loved to take this conversation beyond what it is right now and get your responses as regards what our reporter has been able to say on ground. But this is a particular conversation that we are going to stay on, and definitely we will bring you on board and get more reactions from you. But then we appreciate your presence, your patience and understanding, and what you've been able to contribute so far. Let's quickly go on a short break on the show. When we return, we will definitely continue with other areas. Despite complaints of low power generation and gas shortages, the electricity distribution companies have managed to increase their monthly revenue from January to March 2024. The revenue rose from 95 billion naira to 100 billion naira. This rise in revenue occurred at a time when the country experienced a significant drop in power supply. Now, the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission reported that in February, 97 billion naira revenue was generated. Despite the challenges, the distribution companies achieved an 80% bidding efficiency in January, and the rise in revenue can be attributed to an increase in tariffs. This morning, joining me from Ogun State, Nigeria, is Professor Yemi Oke, Energy Electricity Law, University of Lagos. Thank you so much, Professor Oke, for joining us on the show.
Good morning, and thanks for having me.
Professor Oke, tell us, is there a justification for the hike in tariff that gave birth to an increase in revenue? We're talking about 5 billion naira for DisCos, despite a significant drop in power supply during January till March 2024.
Well, you are bringing me back to my whole argument on tariff. Tariff is a question of a number of things. One, how much is spent to generate a kilowatt, and how much is that to be sold per kilowatt hour? How many Nigerians are metered? What is the quantum of the overall electricity that we generate in Nigeria as a country? The challenge is that we've not been generating enough. So on the cost per unit of what is generated is quite huge and expensive. We were generating about 4,000 thereabout before privatization, so we're still oscillating around 4,000, 4,005 at most. Then you are to spread your costs, including cost of production, staff, management expenses, and others, on the less than 5,000 or 4,000 megawatt that is generated. So you factor in, that goes into the cost per unit. If we're able to generate more, then we can spread the cost. That's the first challenge. The DisCos who bought those entities, they don't have the financial wherewithal to expand the infrastructure. So there's a lot of transmission losses. There's a lot of collection losses. And a huge chunk of what is generated and transmitted and distributed is bypassed by some scrupulous Nigerians and business entities. So there's a challenge as to what we have. And the DisCos are hugely exposed in terms of that. What the federal government did, which I subscribe to, was to pull back the amount of subsidy in the power sector so that the DisCos and other entities can sit back and figure out how they will get better efficient in terms of their collection and other losses. And they also need to factor in that government is no longer subsidizing to this extent. Now, what is the actual full value of what we are generating and distributing? How much can we afford to give to Nigerian consumers? Justifiably, yeah, they have to increase. the tariff. But then Nigerians should not, and definitely not be paying for darkness. That is where my own grounds, of course, lies. So Nigerians can now control their pattern of consumption. So you are not going to increase tariff and not give me the right of choice, the option to determine whether I want to consume 2 hours, 5 hours, 8 hours of electricity. So, and the consumers will get prudent with what they consume, and they can get metered and pay appropriately for what they consume. And they may decide to put themselves in darkness for a few hours based on what they can afford. But the government should not continue to behave like a reckless Father Christmas, as it were, giving money out on generation as against consumption, because the law is there. So that was why I said government had justifiably pulled back the extent to which they've been subsidizing the power sector, because Nigerians are not actually getting value for their money, which is being used to subsidize. They've been subsidizing waste.
Okay, so that's
allow them to get
Professor
yes, please.
Yes, Professor, okay, that seems to be the bone of contention for many Nigerians. The fact that Nigerians do not really get value for what they pay for, and now we now have a hike in tariff. Now, you mentioned a couple of things. You talked about the deficits in the number of houses being metered in Nigeria. You talked about the GenCos not having enough capacity to generate power and the lack of investments in that particular sector. And some people feel, most especially stakeholders feel, that instead of removing subsidy from the sector and increasing the tariff, why is it that the government couldn't have, in the initial stage, gone about trying to increase the capacity, most especially by seeing how to attract investment into that sector? And when you have enough funds and facilities to move around, then you can now begin to remove subsidy and probably tinker with the issue around increasing the tariff. Because at the end of the day, it is Nigerians who pay more and get less in terms of value. And at the end of the day, it still does not solve the perennial challenges in the power sector.
The way to go about it is this. One, I'm not expecting government to fund the power sector. It's not done anywhere in the world. The government only needs to put in place an enabling environment for prudent investors to come on board and invest in Nigeria's power sector. That's one. Government in this circumstance, in this instance, means federal government and the state government. So we shouldn't extricate the state government, because power is not, it's always been a concurrent thing anyway. Just that the law has just been changed so that state governments can also license for off-grid and on-grid generation, transmission, and distribution. So government, federal and state, will need to put on their thinking cap to put in place strategies to attract investors. I agree with you to that extent. So I also agree that Nigerians will need to start to look at alternatives. We're already looking at options and alternatives to more stable electricity supply we've been having. I frown at a situation in which Nigerians will be forced to pay for darkness. That has never been acceptable to me. If you're going to give me one stable power of electricity, let me know the cost. If I'm going to consume 1 hour or 2 hours, let me know what I'm paying for, and let me get value for money. That's on the side of Nigerians. Also on the side of our Commonwealth, Nigeria's resources have been used to subsidize power wastefully. And I say government should put that back and channel the resources. So we need to get efficient with what we do in the power sector. And I've been saying this for more than 15 years. All is not well with the power sector. I've said more than enough. And short of repeating myself, there's nothing I need to say as far as the challenges of the power sector is concerned that I've not said. But definitely, increase in tariff will mean more money in the pockets of the business. To do what? Of course, to pay their debt and also service their infrastructure. It doesn't translate to automatic profitability for them because they are servicing their debt, which they got years back in dollars at the rate of 116 to $1. And they still have a number of challenges. The equipment they're going to use to expand their structure is denominated in dollars. And there's no way they can charge at parity in dollar. An average Nigerian would not definitely be able to afford that because meaning that if they're going to charge it, now we'll be charging something in the region of 1,004 equivalent. It's not doable. So the money, the increase in revenue doesn't really translate into success for them because most of them, 30% of them are still insolvent.
Okay, so let's do a bit of comparison now and look at it from the angle of these DisCos. Now, according to what we know, about a DisCo earned the highest revenue of about 10 billion naira, while other DisCos like Yola had about 1.5 billion naira, which means that what they've been able to generate during the course of the period under review, of course, is different. We see that large gap in between. Now, I'd like to find out what factors you would attribute these differences to, and probably if there anything that you think that these companies can do to improve efficiency in terms of power generation without inadvertently affecting or tearing to the purse of Nigerians or consumers, as the case is.
So we need to say something. When you look at the net value of earnings of a particular DisCo, we need to advert our mind to the fact that it's not money to DisCo or the DisCos alone. If, for instance, we say Ibadan generated 10 billion naira, the 10 billion naira are going to pay the generation companies to supply the electricity. They're going to pay the transmission company of Nigeria, of course, essentially for gas feedstock and other components. So the money is going to be divided among the players and other agencies involved. So the whole of 10 billion naira is not money that goes directly to a particular DisCo and it remains in the pocket of the DisCo. That's what it is done.
Okay.
There's a certain formula. So because you don't see the GenCos, those who actually generated the electricity, the power that is being distributed, you don't see them bring bills to you. The transmission power lines are also not going to bring their bills to you. The regulator will also not bring bills to an average home. So the money, like the DisCos are like a recovery agent for the players in the value chain. But Nigerians don't know that. So meaning more revenue for the GenCos to pay their debts, for TCN to continue to maintain the transmission infrastructure, and for DisCos also to pay for the services rendered, among others. Because there has been a huge shortfall in the power sector, cash liquidity. So now making more money for them to be able to discharge their respective obligations and pay their debt. There is huge debt overhangs in the value chain on all of them. So that's the structure. So it doesn't mean more money for the DisCos.
Okay.
Well, just that it brings down the level of illiquidity in the system.
Okay.
Try to reduce the level of insolvency in the system, which is really scary.
Professor Yemioke, sadly, the issue around what we are experiencing now as regards industrial action, affordability investments, social unrest, the destruction of facilities and all that will also continue to plague this sector. And a lot of things will need to be done by the Nigerian government if this issue is to be resolved. We are going to draw curtains on this conversation, Professor Yemioke, today, Energy Electricity Law, University of Lagos, but then we appreciate your profound contribution. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, and have a lovely day.
And you too. Let's quickly go on a short break. We'll be back. The Central Bank of Nigeria has announced that international oil companies can sell 50% balance of the repatriated export proceeds to authorized forex dealers aimed at bolstering liquidity and stabilizing the foreign exchange market. Now, the Apex Bank earlier stopped IOCs operating in Nigeria from immediately remitting 100% of their forex proceeds to their parent company abroad. Now, a 50% recourse has been granted. How well can this latest policy achieve its intended purpose? Femi Oladeyin, partner, Agentil Capital Partners, is joining me from Lagos, West Africa's commercial capital. Thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Hi, thank you. It's absolute pleasure once again.
So before now, IOCs could send all their earned money in foreign currency back to their headquarters abroad. Now, the CBN is requiring and asking that they keep about 50% of this money in Nigeria. What's your take on this?
Look, I mean, this is still the continuation of the policies of the central bank to increase supply into the market. We know that supply has been the biggest constraint, despite all the policies that they've introduced in the last few months. We've still not been able to get supply back to the pre-2015, 2016 levels. And what the central bank is just trying to do is to provide liquidity in the market. And as you would imagine, the IOCs are the biggest exporters of Nigerian crude. And obviously that means that they're the biggest earners of foreign exchange. And what the central bank is trying to do right now is to encourage them to sell some of those dollars into the market, at least 50%. I have my thoughts as to how effective that would be and what exactly the longer term plans of the central bank are.
Well, of course, we understand that the issue is around mitigating volatility, ensuring that, as you have said, there is enough FX liquidity and stabilizing the Nigerian naira. But then when you look at this, Femi, do you think these can be achieved? Because some people feel that this is probably a cosmetic approach. But then when we look at it holistically, most especially even how it affects these IOCs, is it in their best interest to do this?
No, fair question you ask. And I think that it's a double-edged sword, right? So because if you think about it this way, the IOCs today, they have naira expenses as part of their production costs, right? Obviously, so your expectation is that some of the naira proceeds or some of the dollar proceeds that they've had in the past would be converted into naira and used to meet their naira expenditure. Now, the only way this really makes any fundamental difference to the market is if an IOC was spending less than 50% of its revenues on its costs. But if it was spending more than 50%, then it's unlikely that there's anything to remit. Also to remember that what we're really doing isn't solving any long-term problems, because if you think about it this way, the IOCs today pay 85% of their profits as per PPT, in addition to royalties and other expenses and costs that they pay to the federal government, which they pay in FX already anyways. So I honestly think that this is cosmetic, as you said. Whilst it would increase short-term availability of FX in the market, long-term, I don't see it doing a significant dent to the demand issues that we've had in the market for some time. It will improve short-term liquidity, but fundamentally, we still need to encourage the IOCs to invest in the Nigerian market and at least try and get our production back to the 2 million barrels levels that we had a few decades ago. And I think that's a longer-term solution to our problems, not just short-term fixes.
Well, as you've said, some financial experts also say that this will potentially encourage IOCs to reinvest some of their earnings back into Nigeria and also ensure efficient management of their forex needs without unnecessary restrictions. So when you look at this new policy, can we call it a way of incentivizing the activities in the sector?
No, I don't think that would work. Part of the biggest problem the market has had, for example, is it took us 20 years to pass the Petroleum Industry Act. And that in itself meant that the investment decisions that IOCs make, those investment decisions have moved on, right? They've moved on to other markets whilst they were waiting for us to get our acts together. I was talking to an IOC CEO literally just before the score, and he was saying to me that, look, they need to make long-term plans, but in Nigeria it's very difficult because policies change on a regular basis, and that's where the challenge is. So again, there's another policy they have to deal with. The central bank now saying to them that they can only repatriate 50% of their export proceeds, and they have to sell, or they can sell 50% to the local market. Those are disincentives for investment. So as much as we're trying to solve one problem, we're creating a bigger one, which is we're stifling investment in the oil and gas sector. And if you looked at what has happened in the last decade in that sector, the reason why we're struggling with production today is simply because the IOCs have refused to invest in Nigeria. And so all of our policies should actually be driven towards encouraging investment in the market.
Okay, so Femi, there are still other issues as regards what the Central Bank of Nigeria is trying to achieve, and one has to do with who or what comes first, flexibility, eligible transactions and all that. Now, in about a few minutes, let's pick it in bits. How do you think, or how will the prioritization of these forex sales work? Will the initial 50% for authorized dealers be sold first, or can IOCs choose which portion to sell and when?
So I don't believe that the central bank can legislate and force IOCs to sell their FX. I believe that that's almost illegal. But what the central bank is to encourage them. I believe that what the central bank is also going to try and do is to incentivize the IOCs to participate in this by making it easier for them to take out the remaining 50%. I think if that happens, then there's an incentive for an IOC to put its cash in the market and sell and meet its naira obligations. Now, another big positive for the IOCs is that in the past, we were dealing with a market where the exchange rate was, there was an official exchange rate and there was a real market exchange rate. The fact that that does not exist anymore in the market gives them further incentives to obviously sell their dollars for equivalent naira value. However, when you talk about prioritization, I believe that the market itself is already an efficient market because it's a willing buyer, willing seller market. And the central bank has removed all the restrictions that existed prior to now. So I would say that there is a strong possibility that whilst this is positive in the short term, it is unlikely to change prioritizations.
Okay, we might just have to end discussion right here. There are also other issues we may need to look at in terms of transparency, oversight, sustainability, and some other that may be something we'll get to look at in our discussions to come. But then, Femi Oladeyin, partner, Argentine Capital Partners, thank you so much for talking to us.